Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for today's Boston Globe Op Talk, the latest in conversation between the Boston Globe's opinion writers and editors and thought leaders. And today is the latest in a series that I am happy to be doing with Boston Globe columnist Michael Cohen about the election season. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Kim. How you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. And we are both thrilled to be joined for this conversation about the future of the Republican Party by Shermichael Singleton. Shermichael is a conservative political consultant. He's a writer, commentator, and the co host of Speakeasy, a podcast about politics and culture. He's also worked for a number of Republican presidential campaigns, including those of former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich, former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney, and HUD Secretary Ben Carson. He's also one of the smartest people I know, so I am thrilled that he can join us. Hi, Shermichael.
Hey, Kimberly, thanks for having me.
Sure, sure. So, as I said, this discussion is about the future of the Republican Party. What happens if Donald Trump wins the presidential election, and what happens to the party if he loses? And I want to start off, Sir Michael, by asking, this is clearly now the way the Republican Party stands. It's the party of Donald Trump. I mean, the latest Gallup poll numbers puts President Trump's overall job approval numbers at 43%, but among Republicans, it's at 94%.
Mhm.
Help us understand, Shermichael, how the Republican Party so quickly transformed into Trumpism.
I mean, look, I think a party will typically attempt to adapt itself to the leader of the party, i.e., the president, whether that's Obama, George W. Bush, and presidents before. What's interesting about President Trump, however, is that one would typically assume that if a normal politician behaved or used some of the rhetoric the president uses in person or via his tweets, that a party would say, this is a bridge too far. I think it's a bit different with President Trump because he's been very, very smart, Kimberly, in giving various sections of the GOP tangible items. So if you look at the Republican Party sort of under an umbrella, if you will, you have your sort of evangelicals, faith-based individuals, you have your Supreme Court's protection of religious rights, et cetera. If you're looking at more of your Chamber of Commerce type Republicans, those are the business folks, the Wall Street folks. I'm going to give you guys a tax cuts. We're going to work and focus on deregulation of various sectors and industry. That's another beneficial thing. The only group that I would argue that the president hasn't really been completely effective with solidifying, at least not completely the way he has with the other two groups, would be more of your moderate type Republicans, the Romney types, folks who probably would be closer to the Bush 1 or Bush 2 type Republicans. Many of them have sort of gone along rather, for whatever purpose. Maybe it's because of relationships or affiliations, but you do have a pocket of them who have sort of said, I don't think this is the direction the party needs to go. We're going to sort of absolve ourselves from a lot of this chaos and either remain on the sidelines muted, or in the case of some Republicans, like individuals behind the Lincoln Project and others, we're going to be a very vocal contrast to the president. And not only are we going to be a contrast, but we're going to attack the president because we don't think this individual deserves to lead the party, let alone be president of the United States. And so it's a really interesting dichotomy of how these various factions, if you will, within the Republican Party have sort of adjusted themselves to the president.
Can I say one quick question here? Can I flip Kim's question around
Sure, Michael.
to ask, is it is it possible that Republican? I mean, I kind of look at this and I think this is more how Republicans, rank and file Republicans, kind of always were. And so, in a sense, like Trump was just reflecting what was the real view inside the party, and I think that Republican leadership, I look at past presidential candidates from McCain and Romney, that they reflected sort of maybe the establishment view of the Republican Party and sort of gave kind of, wink and a nod to sort of more of the racism and the misogyny and sort of the more unhinged conspiracy theorizing Republican Party. And Trump sort of said, no, he sort of, I don't know, cultivated that wing of the party, cultivated that view within the party. And in a sense, that he kind of awakened a beast, if you will. I mean, this kind of viewpoint was always there, and it just needed someone to sort of bring it out into the open, and Trump did that.
I mean, look, you're going to have fringe viewpoints, I would argue, among a sector of voters on both sides, I would argue, but about different things. The question becomes whether or not it is worth engaging with those individual voters who typically are disengaged. They usually don't vote a lot. Again, as you stated, some politicians in the past on the Republican side have sort of given those folks a little bit of crumbs here and there, if you will. So no one wants to proudly say, we want you guys to be a part of our tent. But hey, if you want to vote for us, we'll gladly take and accept your vote. Sure. I think it's been a little different about President Trump is that, he really has gone in a direction that many of his predecessors, I don't think, would have gone in. And that is by saying, not only am I going to speak directly to some fringe elements of the Republican Party and of the base and sort of engage in some of those disengaged voters who may be right-leaning, but I am going to elevate you, and I'm going to elevate many of your views and your ideological subsets as it pertains to how you view the body politic, how it should operate, and how you view leadership as a whole. And that's a very, very different dynamic. And so I think that's really why many Republicans sort of wrestled with this idea of whether or not the president wins or loses. At some point, he will be gone. Presidents come to go. So at some point, there will be a time when Trump is no longer in office. That'll be either after November 3rd or 4 more years from now. And so the question becomes then, what do you now do with this sort of awakened group of people? Now, there's a couple of schools of thoughts. I have some friends who are consultants out in Texas. And when they were running races in 2018, we talked about why the Republicans didn't do very well. And they pointed to the fact that it was simple because Trump wasn't on the ballot. Many of the voters who turned out in 2016 for him said, we only care about Trump. We're not really engaged in Republican politics. We don't really care about what these people are running on for the most part. Yeah, it's intriguing, but if our guy isn't on the ballot, we're not really going to bother being engaged in the process, which a friend of mine said really harmed Republicans in the state. And so the question becomes, well, maybe when Trump leaves, per se, maybe those voters will sort of disengage and Republicanism will go back to the way it was with Romney and McCain and W. Bush and before. However, there's a school of thought among some that once Trump leaves the White House, he will still play a pivotal role, I should say, in Republican politics. And so that question becomes, if the party wants to go in a different direction, how do you necessarily deal with the machinations of an individual who's no longer in office, who doesn't want to go away quietly and build a library and all those things, but who still says, I want to still be the kingmaker? How do you deal with that? And that's a question that I know for a fact many people in the party, including in leadership here in DC, are really beginning to think about that because folks are thinking about what is next. We're isolating a lot of individuals who are coming of age in the era of Trump, particularly minority individuals who may have a natural conservative disposition that if the party were to really focus on Hispanics, a subset of African Americans, particularly Black men, who may be open to a conservative-like message, but do we risk isolating sort of the younger generation within those groups if we don't figure out a way to change direction, change our messaging? And is that possible if President Trump decides, I want to continue to be the kingmaker until I determine I'm not interested anymore? And so those are two interesting schools of thoughts that I have had with a lot of Republican friends of mine who've been around a long, long time. And I don't think anyone has sort of figured that out yet. I think it really does depend on, one, what happens in November, but two, it depends on what President Trump decides to do when he's no longer in office.
So I want to drill down on that a little bit about this idea of how big the party is. I recall in 2013 when Reince Priebus did his post-mortem, report and suggestion in how to make it a big tent party and how to be more inclusive of folks. And it seems like a lifetime ago, it was, pretty quickly dismissed, it seemed. But in a Trump era, when you have, let's be honest, the head of the Republican Party now, the president of the United States, was, cold calling out to white supremacists during a presidential debate. He refuses to even acknowledge Black Lives Matter. He couldn't even speak to the parents of Black children who have to give their kids the talk last night. um, it feels like the president it's very true that the president is refusing to denounce the worst elements of racism in our society. How does the Republican Party make a play for a conservative Black voter? Black folks have the right to want small government
Yeah.
and to want conservative fiscal policy too, but is that even an option now?
I mean, Kimberly, I think it is an option because if you look at Trump's approval rating with Hispanic voters, it is still above 30%, around 30, 35%. That's very intriguing, despite some of what individuals may classify as dangerous language about Hispanics, what individuals might point to as bad policies as it pertains to immigration and what we saw at the borders a couple months ago. I just read a recent article, 500 plus kids are still trying to find their parents. Yet the president still has over 30% support with Hispanics. When you look at African-American men, we've seen an increase of around 4 to 5% approval for Black men under 50 compared to what the president received in 2016. So clearly, Kimberly, there are some aspects of President Trump that individuals like. For Black men, if you look at the cross tabulations, you look at some focus groups for those individuals under 50 and ask, what do you like about Trump? Why? One of the things that a lot of Black men under 50 point to is criminal justice reform. If they haven't been directly impacted by it, they know someone who has. The president speaking directly to that with the First Step Act, promising potentially something similar in a second round. Some individuals find that to be intriguing. Some of his messaging on economics and job creation, again, some of the crosstabs, some of the focus groups point to the fact that some Black men find those things intriguing. So granted, 18%, 20% isn't a large number, Kimberly, but it's way bigger than what Republicans have received from Black voters at all in a very, very, very long time. And so I don't think we can underestimate or overlook that reality. Now, when you talk about African Americans overall, when you talk about Hispanics overall, when you talk about Asians overall, one merely needs to look at 2018 exit results. And we saw overwhelmingly that individuals of each of those racial groups voted overwhelmingly for the Democrat over the Republican. When you look at data from Pew Research, for example, at younger millennials and certainly Gen Z, they overwhelmingly identify with liberalism and Democrats when compared to the Republican Party. And when you go even further into the data and see how they describe the two parties, the adjectives they use to describe the Republican Party are words that I probably can't use on this program. So clearly the party has a problem that at some point is going to have to deal with and rectify. And I think a part of that, Kimberly, is changing the language. I mean, the Republican Party, if you go back to before, even with Nixon, I mean, with all of his craziness, even he was able to get a significant percent of the Black vote. Now, for various reasons, of course, we could get into those nuances if we wanted to, but we can go even further before Nixon and look at some of the previous Republican presidents who was at least able to get around 39, 40% of the Black vote. So we know for a fact that the Republican Party was at least in the past 70 to 80 years capable of being competitive with African Americans. And I think a lot of it, when you do the research and look at a lot of studies on why, it's because many African Americans at the time at least perceived the Republican Party to be open-minded and cognizant of the racial disparities that existed in the country. And I think the reason why there's such a negative and visceral reaction to the party today is because many African Americans just don't believe the party in its current rendition for quite some time now appears to really understand and grasp some of the grievances of racial minorities. And so I always say, Kimberly, the party needs to look at its own history and really sort of replicate what it was doing a merely 70 or 80 years ago and figure out ways to adapt that into articulable messaging, but also to figure out a way to adapt it into real policies, right? It's not enough to come up with fancy messaging that makes me feel good. I need to also be able to look at it through the legislative process. And again, the Republican Party has been able to do that in the past. Why not do it again?
Well, I want to pick up on something, just to pivot a little bit, because it strikes me that the biggest, I know the place where Trump has lost the most support and GOP has lost the most support is among suburban women. I mean, the
Yep.
gender gap in this election is just astounding. I've never seen
Mm-hmm.
like it before. And I was thinking about this because we are talking about it before the show started about, Kelly Loeffler and is running for Senate in Georgia. I'm fascinated by by her and by her campaign. She was picked for that seat to replace Johnny Isakson because Georgia had a problem with female voters. Brian Kemp, the governor, thought they had a problem, wanted to pick somebody who might appeal to suburban women. So, she is, I guess, seen as somewhat more moderate, somebody who had like a pretty established background. Her husband, I mean, has a background in finance, but her husband is president of the New York Stock Exchange. And then last month, or I guess this month actually, she does an event with Marjorie Greene, who is the QAnon congressional candidate from Georgia. Clearly, because she thinks that's going to help her win. This is a person who was picked to appeal to moderate women in Georgia and is now basically hanging out with the most fringe congressional candidate, or one of the most fringe candidates in the country, and seeing this as a political asset in a Republican primary race. So I look at that and I think that's the future of the Republican Party. They're not that they don't have the ability to appeal to suburban women, to appeal to moderates the way they did in the past, because this fringe element is so strong and so powerful and so loud that they can't be ignored, and they have to find a way to accommodate them. Tell me I'm wrong, but that's kind of how I see where the GOP is headed.
I mean, look, I think there are Republican candidates who are looking at a changing landscape in some of their states that were solidly red for a very long time. And if you're looking at, your internal data, you're looking at demography within your own state because of demographic changes, you're looking at perhaps in some states a decrease in Republican registration, and sometimes a gain for Democrats, but certainly individuals who are now saying that they are non-affiliated voters, likely voting for the Democrat over the Republican. You're looking at all those dynamics, Michael. And if you're advising a candidate like Kelly, you're going to say, we need to begin to find voters that can help us make up that gap. We know that we can't reach out to those individuals for whatever the reasons may be with suburban women, moderates, racial minorities. So where else can we make up the gap? Because we know this is going to be a tight race. And if that means reaching out to some of those fringe elements by doing a campaign event with someone who is very popular among individuals in your state who maintain to uphold those beliefs, then so be it. I'm not saying that is the ethical thing to do. I'm not saying that that's the proper thing to do as it pertains to the overall health and longevity of the party. But I think that's a dynamic that many advisors who are advising these candidates are looking at. They're trying to figure out, how can we plug these holes that are coming all over the place? And if that means we have to get a little bit of fringe here, a little bit of, different views here, and I try to be respectful and careful of people's viewpoints, then I think those individuals are advising those candidates, this is what we have to do in order to win. Because again, as you said, this is someone whose husband is president of the New York Stock Exchange. I mean, these are the type of Republicans who will certainly be establishment type figures, multi-millionaire individuals, jet setting all over the place, not the type of people who would be inviting QAnon individuals into their $20 million mansion. And we can be real about that.
Ordinarily, wouldn't you be afraid if you were advising Loeffler that you're going to alienate more moderate Republicans? I mean, it seems to me that there's a calculation being made here that you need those fringe voters more than you have to worry about alienating people who look at those at a candidate like Marjorie Greene and say, I can't support somebody who's getting endorsed by her.
I mean, I think it depends, right? It depends on the math, because if I'm looking at the calculation and I can say, okay, maybe we lose 2% of moderates, perhaps, right? But we know the rest, even if they don't like some of the views we are adopting, they certainly are not going to vote for the Democrat who may have some progressive views as part of their policies, right? There's no way they're going to go that way. So they are going to stick with us. So if we lose 1% or 2%, we may be able to mathematically make that up. I mean, this ultimately comes down to the math all the time. I mean, anyone who works on a campaign, you're looking at those numbers, right. and the numbers are constantly shifting. And as they shift, you're constantly figuring out, okay, where can we pull from? What adjustments do we need to make to bring those individuals back into our camp? And so I'm almost certain that those individuals are doing all of that math. They're doing some wizardry there. And at the end of the day, if they can make up for potential loss, which again, I wouldn't imagine it would be any more than 2% at the most, then I even would be comfortable with saying we can go ahead and go in this direction if my only objective is to win. And I know for a fact that if we don't reach out to other individuals that we typically wouldn't engage with, there is just no mathematical way we could win this thing. At the end of the day, campaigning is all about winning, right? The election have consequences. And sometimes winning is an ugly, uncomfortable thing. And sometimes you have to do things that you may not ordinarily do if the playing field was in your corner. It is not right now. Georgia's a state that is certainly becoming a purple state. I would imagine, if not in this election, certainly by the next one, it will look a whole lot like Virginia. And I think Republicans recognize that. And so, again, you got to figure out how can you make up for those shortcomings mathematically? Where are those groups that haven't necessarily been engaged with over time? And what is it going to take to engage them, to ultimately target them, to ultimately get them to vote?
Right. So let me step back and talk about the bigger picture a little bit here, because the question that I get asked a lot is this a Republican civil war? Who's going to emerge the winner? What is this bigger fight, right? And I think about who are the most popular governors in the country. It's always flip-flops between Charlie Baker of Massachusetts and Larry Hogan of Maryland. Both Republicans, both hugely popular. Now, it might be easier for them to be popular in a place like Massachusetts or Maryland than elsewhere. But then you have other people, Mitt Romney, who I wouldn't really consider a moderate. I consider him a conservative, but he's someone who on occasion will speak out against Donald Trump. And then you have folks like John Kasich, or former RNC chairman Michael Steele, who's a part of the Lincoln Project now. Is it going to be, if Donald Trump loses, might folks like that sort of emerge as the leaders of a new version of the Republican Party? Or will we see, the other folks, like the people who support Trump in the Senate, and the Jim Jordans and the Donald Trump Juniors emerging as the next generation? Is it going to be a battle between those two factions? And if so, who's going to win that?
Who's going to prevail? Yeah, no, Kimberly, again, I think it really does depend on what Trump does. I am being so serious about that. If the president decides to stick around, I don't see how the Bakers and the Hogans of the world could win this ideological paradigm shift. I just don't see it, because the president's approval is it's so high in the party. It's at the point now where even the donor class, for the most part, have decided to back the president. Again, going back to some of those tangible things that he's been very, very smart to make sure he gives individuals that he really needs to stay in his corner. And so I really do think that the Republican Party right now, as it currently stands, is really in the midst of trying to figure out, what does conservatism mean under the Republican Party today, right? And how is that actualized through its leadership? And how is that actualized through the policies that the party overall supports? And ideologies do shift and change. This is well documented by every political theorist for the past couple of 100 years now. And sometimes they go to become fringe, and sometimes they sort of swing back to the other side. And I think right now there are a lot of outside dynamics and other variables that are really sort of impacting the Republican Party and impacting this whole idea of conservatism as a governing philosophy, if you will. And it just doesn't appear to me, Kimberly, that the more moderate elements of the party really have much to stand on right now. And I'm not saying that it's not possible that if Mr. Trump were to exit politics altogether, that it's not possible to see a shift again. I certainly think so. But I think those individuals would also have to engage potentially with some of those Trump supporters, because I don't think not all of them will necessarily go away, because some of them will still be elected into office. And so that's a question I wish I had an answer to, but I really do think a lot of it comes down to President Trump and the role he decides to play after his election. He's just been such a defining figure, Kimberly. I would even argue that Trump has perhaps changed conservatism more so than what's the guy, National Review founder?
William Buckley. William Buckley.
Michael, yeah, right, Buckley, more so than Buckley, and Buckley, clearly for what 30, 40 years was sort of a redefining force, if you will, in conservatism. And then you had the Crystals of the world who sort of developed this idea of neoconservatism, but I would argue that Trump has been far more of a political phenomenon, if you will, in just how dynamic he has been of a force in completely changing the idea of the Republican Party and conservatism. And I would argue 10, 20 years from now, I don't think political scientists or philosophers will even, in assessing the Republican Party at that point in conservatism, will even define it by the same metrics we have defined it in the past. And that's quite amazing when you think about it.
That really is. And my last question for you, Michael, is there any circumstance that you, someone you consider yourself a conservative, would consider yourself a Republican again?
I would want to see the party change the way it articulates its messaging to minorities, number one. And I would just like to see the party just get away from some of those fringe things. Conservatism to me represents a lot of things, but most importantly, it is a way of life. The great conservative philosopher Roger Scruton recently died of cancer a couple of months ago, who I had the opportunity of meeting about 2 years ago, I believe. Was sort of considered the Edmund Burke of today, considered the greatest modern conservative theorist and philosopher since Edmund Burke. He wrote a brilliant piece for the New York Times, I want to say 3 years ago, about President Trump, titled "What Trump Doesn't Understand About Conservatism." And while he did give Mr. Trump credit on the Supreme Court, I give the president credit on those things. I give the president credit on deregulation in certain regards. I give the president credit on some of his world views as it pertains to trade. I mean, I think, though I don't necessarily agree with all of his positions there, I do think he is right on the fact that we need to reshift our focus into some of the trade agreements we have with certain countries so that they're more fair and balanced for the American people, blah, blah, blah. I agree with those things. But beyond those things, Kimberly, you have a philosophy that says of itself, it has been shaped and created over time, right? And so the question becomes, as Scruton would say, conservatives have always dealt with and battled internally as things progress, because it's an innate part of human nature to want to move forward. What aspects of culture, what aspects of human behavior, what aspects of our beliefs and ideals do we throw away that may no longer be good, and what aspects do we maintain? And so that type of intellectual discourse is something that, for me, seriously needs to return to the Republican Party, for me to say, okay, sure, I'll identify with the party again, but I certainly am not going to change my value system as far as being a conservative. That's just who I am. But not wanting to identify with the party, for me personally, just gives me sort of the freedom to say, guys, I am going to be objective as I can with critiquing some of the issues that I don't like about the party. And being a part of the party, I felt too guarded in I guess my ability to really do that objectively, because I felt, hey, I'm a Republican. I need to sort of maintain and carry for my party. And I just got to the point, Kimberly, where I just didn't want to do that anymore. And so, again, for me to want to identify, the party is going to have to make some changes as it pertains to race with its language. It's going to have to make some changes as it pertains to certain elements of our society that it says it's okay to come up under our umbrella. And I would like to see the intellectualism sort of return. That stuff is important to me. That's why I fell in love with politics from the get-go, is because I like the complications of the machinations of politics and policies and hashing those things out. Iron sharpens iron. It is hard work. It is brutal work, but I love it. And I want to see the party return to those things.
Well, sure, Michael, we could talk all day with you, but the time goes quickly. But we thank you so much for helping us kick off this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Michael.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So, Michael, where does that leave us in the political sphere? Last night, there was the last of the debates between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. What did you think? What are your thoughts?
I mean, look, everyone, I think as with everything in American politics the last 4 years, the focus is to talk about Trump. But I thought the real story of the night was that Joe Biden gave probably his best debate performance that I think I've ever seen. I think he was really on the ball last night. I thought he was very effective. I tweeted at one point that I've lost count of all the really effective, great answers that he had. He just, the thing that came across to me, something that I noticed when I sort of was on the campaign trail with him, feels like forever ago, uh, was that he's kind of a little of a policy wonk. Like he knows the policy stuff pretty well, and he's pretty good at expressing and verbalizing. And I thought he did a nice job of sort of talking about policy. But I also think what makes Biden such an effective politician, what makes him, I think, appealing is that he's an appealing guy, right? He's a nice guy. He's a decent man. And I think he had a way of talking to Americans via the debate stage, and I think the way it was accessible, it was approachable, that I think undercut all of the sort of the silly criticisms that Trump makes of him. I just thought it was a very effective performance all around.
Yeah, I thought the former vice president did a good job as well. I mean, first off, I have to give mad props to my friend Kristen Welker, who I think
Yes,
handled the debate masterfully. I think people on Twitter for sure didn't fully understand how the mute button was supposed to work, like as if she had it sitting there and she did not. It just meant
yeah,
that only one mic was on during the opening of every question and the rest was up to the moderator. And I think
right,
she demanded that it be a respectful discourse, and she got that respect. So I want to start there. But yeah, I mean, it seemed going into this, right? We had all these signals that President Trump was going to try to replay the 2016 play by having these like these pre-announcements and pre-interviews with people who have dirt on Joe Biden, and
right,
it was
right,
reminiscent of bringing Bill Clinton's accusers before a debate with Hillary Clinton, and trying to create new emails, doing
right.
all these things. And none of that connected. I think for
That's right,
most Americans, for Donald Trump supporters who have been following all of this on Twitter and in the dark web or wherever it is that these things
the Peter Swamp, I
circulate,
think it is. Yeah,
they got it, right?
right.
But the average American didn't even, Donald Trump couldn't even articulate whatever scandal he was trying to lay on Joe Biden.
Yes,
And so that didn't seem to work at all. The only thing that I was kind of dismayed about afterwards is it seemed almost immediately that the reaction from the fact that Donald Trump was not steamrolling Joe Biden, talking over him constantly like he did in the last debate, ranting and raving, because he seemed rather calm when he delivered a slew of lies and
right.
failed to connect with Black people and pushed a
Yes.
conspiracy theory. They gave him good marks, and it's like, no, come on, people,
That's
can we
just,
get back to an America where the president of the United States, the bar is high, and
yes, yes.
standing and
Thank you.
issuing so many lies that fact checkers were exhausted, just because you do it in a calm tone of voice, just because when asked specifically to talk to parents of Black children, you can't. Just because you do that calmly, that's not a good
And I
performance.
don't even think he did it that calmly, frankly. I think just
Yeah.
in relationship to the first debate, it was calmer. But I totally agree with you, by the way. And this is like the thing that makes me kind of crazy. I mean, it's not just that he lied all the time, which of course he did, and you're absolutely right about that. It's that he cannot articulate any sort of element of public policy. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't know how to express it properly. Everything he views the prism of how it affects him. I mean, he is just the most inarticulate, incoherent politician I've ever seen. And I think above anything else, what really strikes me about this is that and I wrote a column about this a few months ago. He has expressed absolutely given the American people no idea of what he would do in a second term. Absolutely none. And I dare anybody to try to come up with an explanation of what he will do in a second term. You go to his website, there's no policy prescriptions, there's no ideas of what he's going to do, there's no, proposals, nothing. And it came
The
across
RNC
like
didn't even do a platform. It's just
RNC,
like,
thank
we
you.
don't know what he's going to do, so no
Didn't
platform.
even do a platform. Did the same way they had 4 years ago. So the country's the same way it was 4 years ago. I mean, there's nothing. There's no substance there. And I really do think if you vote for this man again, it's just because I don't know. I mean, you just like him for some strange reason. I don't know I don't totally understand it, but there's really nothing in what he is saying that would offer a clue as to what he would do in 4 more years as president. Nothing.
No, and he's sounding the same things. I mean, I think the answer is if you want to vote for him, it's because you still want a wall.
Yeah.
at the southern border. It's because you still wouldn't want Muslims coming into the country, even though that's not a problem anymore. Now it's about the Black Lives as Antifa. If you
Right.
vote for
Right.
him because you don't like Antifa, you don't want people coming over the border. You want to be exclusionary there. And, it's 2016 in replay
That's
in
right.
that sense. But I mean, I think probably the most effective thing that Joe Biden said last night was preparing Americans for the type of winter we're going to have in this
Yeah.
pandemic with numbers today in October is when the United States reached its record in new cases. I
Yes.
mean, think about it. We already went through that first, really traumatic era, and now it's even higher.
And it's going to
And
go even
and
higher.
it's going to go even higher. And Donald Trump did not take any responsibility for the failures of the administration up till now and doesn't have a plan other than to say a vaccine's coming and we're going to give it to everybody. I mean, that's
Well,
not the truth.
this is exactly right. And this is a bit I'm struck by. Like literally, it appears that the only solution to dealing with the pandemic is to elect a new president, because there's no indication whatsoever that Trump or anyone around him is even focused on dealing with COVID. I mean, this is a thing that it is really a stunning statement that he couldn't articulate any kind of plan for moving forward except we'll get a vaccine, which he at one point said it's almost ready. It is ready. I mean, it's not going to be ready until for months, and lots of Americans are going to die. Lots of Americans are going to die, and it is it's just it's hard to find the words for it. I mean, he literally can't articulate a plan, and there is no plan. And until
Yeah.
Joe Biden becomes president in January, if that happens, there will be no plan. It's just it's extraordinary confluence of events, and the fact that those who support the president seem to be okay with the fact that he is that mass death has become sort of a part of our lives for the last 7 months and will continue is really a stunning statement about where we are as a country right now. I mean, there's no other way to put it. It's just it's incredibly depressing that people will support somebody who literally has done nothing and will do nothing to deal with this pandemic.
So Michael, what do you think with less than 2 weeks left, we should be looking for? There polls that you've seen that caught your eye? One thing that I saw today that caught my eye is in an interview this morning, James Carville was asked what state, if you had to pick one state to
Mm-hmm.
look at that might be an indicator of what it is. He picked Georgia, which I thought was
Interesting.
extraordinary, that if there is any at all possibility, I mean, I'm not sure that there is, but I mean, I guess it speaks to the fact that you have places like North Carolina and Texas and Arizona, which were so red for so long, but it may not stay that red. They're at least purple now, and we don't know which side of that red and blue it may come out on election day. What do you think?
I mean, it's funny. I would have said Georgia or Texas. I think what's
Hmm.
happening in Texas is fascinating because you've got at this point something like 65% of all of the 2016 electors already voted. You're almost certainly going to go above 100%. It may even happen before election day, which is incredible. It strikes me that Texas has often had low turnout. That kind of high turnout, I certainly could see a good possibility where Democrats win there. That they're even competitive is pretty crazy. But imagine where the Democrats win Texas and Georgia. That is a potential realignment in American politics. I mean, it is a really enormous shift. So I'm looking at places like that, Texas and Georgia. The thing that I'm sort of focused on a little bit is there a wave coming? And I thought there was a little evidence of it a week or two ago, and it seemed to have dissipated. But when do we start to see places like Texas and Georgia or Ohio or Iowa begin to move more firmly into Biden camp? If that happens, I think a wave is possible. I think also if we see some of the House and Senate polling suggesting as much, and there is some indication of the House polling from some of the I guess what we consider toss-up House districts seems to be moving more toward the Democrats. I don't think we've seen it yet, but I think that may be coming, and if it does, I think that would suggest that maybe there is a wave coming.
And I think we have to remember to remind ourselves to be patient too with the results. I
Yes.
mean, not only, I think the results of the presidential will come in sooner, but a lot of these other races, it may take some time. If you recall in 2018, when everyone was predicting the blue wave, and then on election night in the morning after the election, they said, oh, well, there were a couple pickups, but it was no blue
Right,
wave.
right.
And about 2 weeks later, it's like, oh, wait, no, there was totally a blue
Hey,
wave.
I
It just took us a while to see it.
And I remember seeing James Carville on TV the night of it, like around 8 o'clock, saying, "I don't think Democrats are going to do that well tonight, actually." And he because they got lost in Florida, and it turns out, Democrats
He did
had an
really
amazing
well.
night. I think I'm going to say something that's probably I shouldn't say, but I have a really strong sense that we are going to know on election night who won. I think that we are going to have a pretty good
Beyond
sense
the presidential.
on the presidential.
On the
Because
presidential, but okay.
but I
Okay.
don't Senate and House hard to say, but I
Yeah.
think it will be apparent on election night that who is won, and I think that that there'll be some states where it'll take a little bit longer, like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I
Yeah.
don't think there's going to be as much confusion as people thought there would be a few weeks ago. I could be wrong about that, but that is my suspicion that we'll have a.
I think it's a possibility that the winner will be clear on election night, and it's certainly a possibility if, in the event that the same candidate wins a number of states, like Florida, which should be or keep. They keep telling us that Florida results will come back quickly.
Yeah, of
I'm assured by all my friends in Florida. I still remember, the hanging chads, so I remain a
course,
little skeptical. But Florida, Arizona, if North Carolina,
North
if
Carolina.
somebody,
Yeah,
if one candidate picks up all of those, it's going to be really difficult, even if you go straight through the Midwest to beat that. So I think it depends on which states are the deciders that we could find out. But I really do think this idea of how the rest of these races go from the House and Senate to state houses, it may take some time, but just be careful on that front. And I want to say to our audience, I
yeah.
have been incorporating audience questions. I forgot to say at the top that I was going to do that, and I haven't identified each one. But both our questions to Shermichael and our questions to each other include things that were brought up by the audience. And one of them I think is an interesting thought is depending how the results of the election and
Hmm.
how long it takes and all the legal challenges that are already underway and will continue. Michael, what impact do you think that will have on the discussion about the electoral college and whether or not it needs to go?
Well, I think the problem here is that Republicans are just going to fight this tooth and nail because it's the only way they remain politically viable. I mean, one thing I'm struck by, nobody thinks that Trump is going to win the popular vote. Nobody. I mean, the most forecasters put it basically 99% that Biden wins. So from that perspective, Republican only real chance of winning is if they can win in the electoral college. So I don't think you're going to see, unfortunately, that kind of change. And I think, Democrats may convince themselves that if they have a big victory, we don't need to change it. We just did pretty well in the electoral college. So at this point, I mean, I think there are, other changes I think that are more like, I should that are more likely to happen. Filibuster reform,
Yes.
statehood, court packing, which, by the way, after some of these decisions by the Supreme Court, and you can talk more about this, the Alabama case, where
Yeah.
they basically prevented curbside voting,
Yes,
Pennsylvania
which was
case,
meant to be for the Americans with Disabilities Act
exactly.
because there are stairs inside this voting place in Alabama, but they were implementing it to help people protect themselves in the pandemic, and the Supreme Court allowed them to eliminate that, and so
Right.
there is no curbside voting in Alabama.
And it wasn't even, by the way, mandatory curbside voting. It was like if
Right,
counties
it was
wanted
the
to do it, they
option.
could, and they banned
Correct,
it.
and
And
they
then the
banned it.
Pennsylvania
Yes.
decision, where four conservative judges basically said overturned the decision of the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court about
Yeah,
interpreting election law in Pennsylvania, which with Amy Coney Barrett on the court could end up
may
5-4. And
have
if you
come
saw,
out
I'm sure you
differently.
saw this, the Pennsylvania Republicans resubmitted this case, assuming
Yeah.
they'll get a better decision from Amy Coney Barrett. That
Yep.
to me is a terrifying element, just trajectory of where we're going on voting rights in this country, and makes the case even more strongly for expanding the court if Democrats win in November.